Three skidoo, what do you know, what do you say? I'm EJ, this is NonCompete.
Don't worry, I'm not going to do the old-timey voice and antics for the rest of the video. I just had to grab your attention in the first few seconds because the algorithm of YouTube demands that I humiliate myself for your clicks and engagement. Today's video is a reading of the I.W.W. and the Black Worker, written by labor historian and Marxist teacher Philip Foner in January of 1970. Foner spent an entire career documenting the history of socialist movements, black liberation struggle, and unionism in the United States. As his nephew and fellow historian Eric Foner wrote, he edited the writings of Frederick Douglass at a time when, believe it or not, nobody remembered him. He edited 7 volumes of documents on the history of black labor in the United States and collections of material from black political conventions in the 19th century, and he did it all without research assistance or grants. Before we turn to Dr. Foner's writing, I think I should explain the fundamental concept of the IWW, industrial unionism. Industrial unionism is basically this idea that all workers in all industries and all fields and all nations all around the world should come together to form one big union, and that unions of all these trades should foster solidarity and collaborate with one another, strike with one another, and plan together with the goal of eventually abolishing the wage system of capitalism altogether. I actually made a video a few years back on why you, yes, you, should join the IWW, and since then, I've had quite a few people tell me that they did end up going on to join the IWW because of that video. So that's really awesome. That feels great. If you haven't seen the video, check it out and consider joining the IWW. And if you do join the IWW because you heard about it from us on this channel, please let us know, because that kind of stuff is what keeps us going. We love to hear when folks are organizing, getting involved, and joining the revolution as a result of their work. That is really why we keep making these videos. Anyway. This philosophy of industrial unionism stands in contrast to craft unionism, which was primarily championed in the early 20th century in the USA by the American Federation of Labor. Ooh. Yes, we are biased here at NonCompete. Biased in favor of the working class. In contrast to the industrial unionist philosophy of the IWW, craft unionists believe that labor should be organized strictly by trade or craft, segregated into separate unions which pursue the interests of those workers that are working in that specific field. Essentially, craft unionism calls on workers to pursue their own separate interests and to work within the system of capitalism for, reform, hoping only to improve their own work conditions within their given craft or trade or field, often at the expense of other workers in other fields and in other regions. It sucks, and unfortunately, it ended up winning and taking over unions in the USA, and it's partly why unions have been gutted, and it's also why there are a lot of reactionary strains of thought and ideology within unions. We've talked about how trade unions in the USA basically were on board with the Vietnam War because they were making a shitload of money making munitions and weapons for the Vietnam War. There's a lot of reactionary history of unionism in the USA, unfortunately. That'll be a subject for another video. But suffice to say, given the more insular, segregated, and self-centered and liberal ideological underpinnings of craft unionism, it should come as no surprise that craft unions and the American Federation of Labor have a long history of racial discrimination in the USA, with many craft unions remaining segregated well into the 1960s. The industrial workers of the world, on the other hand, have roots in racial solidarity between workers. One of the founders, Eugene Debs, had tried in vain to get black and white railroad workers to organize together in the late 19th century. This had a profound effect on Eugene Debs. Many of the other founders had similar experiences, and it was unanimously agreed by all the founders and early members of the IWW that the IWW would exist to build solidarity between workers of every race, gender, and creed. The second woman to join the IWW was Lucy Parsons, a black socialist who was famous for fighting on a variety of liberation fronts throughout the early 20th century, and another early IWW leader, Ben Fletcher, who was one of the most important labor leaders of the early 20th century. I do hope that in the future we can make videos focusing specifically on Lucy and Ben and other famous Wobblies from the early 20th century. And by the way, this article was way too long for one YouTube video, so I've split it up into 2 parts. The next part will come out in a couple weeks, or it might be out right now if you're watching this. A couple weeks after this is a new video. So either way, be sure to subscribe for the exciting conclusion, or click the link to the exciting conclusion in the description below, depending on where you are in time and space. For now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the IWW and the Black Worker by Philip Foner.
In 1913, Mary White Ovington, one of the founders of the NAACP, wrote in her article, The Status of the Black Person in the United States, there are two organizations in this country that have shown they do care about full rights for black people. The first is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The second organization that attacks segregation against black people are the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW has stood with black people. The second organization to which Miss Ovington referred, popularly known as the Wobblies, was founded in the summer of 1905 by progressive-minded elements in the American labor and socialist movements, headed by Eugene V. Debs, Daniel De Leon, and William D. Big Bill Haywood, who were convinced of three basic principles. 1. The superiority of industrial unionism over craft unionism in the struggle against the monopolistic, highly integrated organizations of employers. 2. The impossibility of converting the conservative American Federation of Labor into a type of organization which would achieve real benefits for the majority of working men and women. And 3, the ineffectiveness of the existing organization of the industrial and radical type to build a movement which would organize and unite the entire working class regardless of skill, color, sex, or national origin. Clearly, in the eyes of these elements, a new organization of labor was necessary, one that would correspond to modern industrial conditions and through which the working people might finally secure complete emancipation from wage slavery for all workers. It was this conviction that led to the formation of the Industrial Workers of the World. At 9 a.m. on June 1905 in Chicago's Brands Hall, Big Bill Haywood, militant secretary-treasurer of the Western Federation of Miners, called the 200 delegates representing 43 organizations to order and declared, "This is the Continental Congress of the Working Class." Immediately thereafter, he made it clear that the new organization of labor about to come into being would take a definite stand against any and all discrimination based upon race or color. In this indictment of the American Federation of Labor, which he declared contemptuously does not represent the working class, he cited specifically the well-known fact that there are organizations that are affiliated with the AFL, which, in their constitution and bylaws, prohibit the initiation of or conferring the obligation on a colored man. Haywood pledged that such anti-working class racist practices, along with other restrictions on the rights of black workers to join the labor movement, would be swept into oblivion by the newly organized industrial union. At a later session, the delegates adopted the Constitution and bylaws of the Industrial Workers of the World with the motto, "An injury to one is the concern of all," a modification of the old Knights of Labor motto. The first section of the bylaws stated that no working man or woman shall be excluded from membership because of creed or color. Haywood, in an interview with the press, told reporters that although unions affiliated with the AFL discriminated against black workers, to the IWW it did not make a bit of difference whether he is a black man or a white man. Despite its pledge, the IWW appears to have accomplished little in the way of organizing black workers in the first 4 years of its existence. Torn apart by internal ideological dissensions and by repeated resignations and expulsions, seriously weakened by the impact of the Depression following the Panic of 1907, the IWW hardly organized any workers at all. In 1909, its membership was down to 3,700, in contrast to the 1,488,872 who were affiliated in that year to the American Federation of Labor, and only a negligible number of those members were black. Yet though it was written off by Samuel Gompers and other American Federation of Labor leaders, the IWW was far from dead. In the next few years, organizers of the IWW would make the Wobblies known throughout the nation for their famous free speech fights and their unionizing drives in the steel and textile industries of the East, the lumber camps of the Northwest and Southeast, the farmlands of the Pacific Coast and the Great Midwest, and the maritime and shipping industries throughout the country. The spectacular rise of the IWW after 1909 would bring the principle of industrial unionism, under which all workers in an industry were organized into one big union, and the principle of labor solidarity, which the IWW preached day in and day out, to the attention of hundreds of thousands of unorganized American workers, including the most unorganized of all, the black workers. Beginning in 1910, the IWW made a determined effort to recruit black membership. Leaflets and pamphlets were distributed in the thousands to convince black workers that the only hope for remedying the miserable status they faced in American society was through the Industrial Workers of the World. Black people have no chance in the old-line trade unions, an IWW leaflet argued. They do not want him. They admit him only under compulsion and treat him with contempt. There's only one labor organization in the United States that admits the colored worker on a footing of absolute equality with the white, the Industrial Workers of the World. In the IWW, The colored worker, man or woman, is on equal footing with every other worker. He has the same voice in determining the policies of the organization, and his interests are protected as zealously as those of any other member. Black people, I.W.W. literature emphasized, were subject to discrimination first because of their color, and second because, for the most part, black people still belong in the category of the unskilled. This state of affairs could not be wiped out by appeals to sentiment alone. It could only be altered by the organization of black people in a union which educated its members to reorganize all workers as equal, regardless of color, and which organized the unskilled by the only method through which they could be organized, industrial unionism. Such a union was the I.W.W. All I.W.W. journals participated actively in this educational campaign, including The Voice of the People, the southern organ of the I.W.W. published in New Orleans. This paper was edited by Covington Hall, born in Woodville, Mississippi in 1871, an adjutant general of the United States Sons of Confederate Veterans, who became a radical, a socialist, and an active organizer for the I.W.W., especially among black people in the South. Covington Hall regularly featured appeals in The Voice of the People, urging white workers in the South to remember how racism had always been used by the ruling class to divide black and white to the injury of both, and predicting that no real improvement could come to the conditions of either black or white unless they united to destroy the chief weapon of a class that profited by keeping both separated. In an article entitled Down with Race Prejudice, published in December 1912, Phineas Eastman asked his fellow workers of the South if they wish real good feeling to exist between the two races, and each is necessary to the other's success, to please stop calling the colored man. The tone some use is an insult, much less the word. Fellow worker is the only form of salutation a rebel should use. Members of the I.W.W. were constantly reminded that the organization of black people was an economic bread and butter issue. Leaving black people outside of a union makes them potential, if not actual, scabs, dangerous to the organized worker, to say nothing of their own interests as workers. Race prejudice on the job could only have one result: keeping the workers fighting each other while the boss gets the benefits. The idea fostered by the capitalists that the white worker was superior was part of the same game. Actually, he's only superior if he shows that he can produce more wealth for the boss than his colored brother can. In an appeal directed especially to Southern workers, the I.W.W. asked, "If one of you were to fall in a river and could not swim, and a black person came along who could swim, would you drown rather than accept his offer of aid? Hardly. That is the I.W.W. position. Labor organized on race lines will drown. Only organized on class lines will it swim. Don't let them sidetrack you from the main line, which is, shall we be freemen or slaves?" The I.W.W. condemned all manifestations of Jim Crowism. It denounced the lynching of black people as savagery, pointing out that it was usually resorted to when black people are demanding more of their product. In another pamphlet, the I.W.W. pointed out 2 lynchings a week, one every 3 or 4 days. That is the rate at which people in this land of the free and home of the brave have been killing colored men and women for the past 30 years, put to death with every kind of torture that human fiends can invent. The pamphlet made it clear that the wrongs of the black person in the United States were not confined to lynchings. When allowed to live and work for the community, he is subjected to constant humiliation, injustice, and discrimination. In the cities, he is forced to live in the meanest districts where his rent is doubled and tripled while conditions of health and safety are neglected in favor of the white sections. In many states, he is obliged to ride in special Jim Crow cars, hardly fit for cattle. Almost everywhere, all semblance of political rights is denied him. When the black man goes to ask for work, he meets with the same systematic discrimination. Thousands of jobs are closed to him solely on account of his color. He is considered only fit for the most menial occupation. In many cases, he is forced to accept a lower wage than is paid to white men for the same work. Everywhere, the odds are against him in the struggle for existence. Throughout this land of liberty, so-called, the black worker is treated as an inferior. He is cursed and spat upon. In short, he is treated not as a human being, but as an animal, a beast of burden for the ruling class. When he tries to improve his condition, he is shoved back into the mire of degradation and poverty and told to keep his place. In a leaflet entitled To Colored Working Men and Women, the I.W.W. pointed out, "If you are a wage worker, you are welcome in the I.W.W. halls, no matter what your color." By this you may see that the I.W.W. is not a white man's union, not a black man's union, not a red man's union, but a working man's union. On September 19, 1912, the industrial worker carried the following news report and comment. Fearing that the I.W.W. will organize the steel mills in the Pittsburgh district, the Carnegie Steel Company is importing black people so as to create racial hatred and prevent solidarity. It won't work. The IWW organizes without regard to color. The only black person we fight is he who employs labor. There is no color line in the furnace hells of the Steel Trust, and there will be none in the one big union. White, black, or yellow, the workers of the world must unite.
I say, this is an enjoyable talkie, is it not? Even though the concept of having sound with a motion picture is anachronistic to the time period of the subject of this video, as during the 1910s, nearly all films that were being viewed by the public at large would have been silent.
No, we're not doing that. I just wanted to tell you, if you really enjoy what you're seeing here, I hope you'll consider subscribing to our other channels in the NonCompete cooperative family. NonCompete Live, where we do live streams and talk to workers around the world, including Wobblies, every single week, as well as Breadville, where we do zany comedy and puppet shows and cartoons. That's at youtube.com/Breadville.
The IWW, unlike most unions of the time and since, practiced what it preached even in the deepest South, where it raised the banner of no race, no creed, no color, and united black and white workers in a common struggle. This slogan was proclaimed on an international scale. In 1910-11, the Industrial Workers Union of South Africa, a branch of the IWW founded by wobbly seamen from the United States, conducted a vigorous campaign to convince the rank and file of white workers of South Africa that their real enemy is not the colored laborer, and that it is only by combining and cooperating irrespective of color that the standard of life of the whites can be maintained and improved. The union led the strike of trainwaymen of Johannesburg, in which black and white workers for the first time united in struggle. The Voice of Labor, the IWW's South African organ, asserted that while the strike was not successful, it had taught the white and black workers of South Africa some much-needed lessons. It's clear that with the exception of the United Mine Workers, which was affiliated to the AFFL, the IWW was the only labor organization in the second decade of the 20th century which stood squarely for the organization of black workers on the basis of complete equality. The Industrial Worker, official organ of the IWW, summed up the IWW's attitude. In this country, every 10th person is of acknowledged black descent, and a large percentage of these 10 million are wage workers. There may be for the whole society of America a black problem, but with the interests of the industrial workers of the world into the industrial arena, there was no further need for the labor problem to be complicated by a racial problem. The IWW accepts the black wage worker, asking of him the same initiation fees and dues as his white brother, and giving him the same membership privileges as are the common property of all who join. The fight of the black wage slave is the fight of the white wage slave, and the two must rise or fall together. Their economic interests are identical, and an injury to one is an injury to the other. To the IWW, there is no race problem. There is only a class problem. The economic interests of all workers, be they white, black, brown, or yellow, are identical, and all are included in the program of the IWW. It has one program for the entire working class, the abolition of the wage system. Yet it's also clear that the IWW's answer to the special problems of black people facing discrimination, segregation, deprivation of civil and political rights, and violence was weakened by a failure to understand that for the blacks there was a race problem, and it was no answer to tell black people that in the abolition of the wage system lay their salvation. Despite its advanced position against race prejudice and its opposition to segregation in the labor movement, the failure of the IWW to understand the special aspects of black problems restricted its appeal to the black masses. How can the black man combat this widespread injustice, asked the IWW. How can he not only put a stop to lynchings, but force the white race to grant him equal treatment? How can he get his rights as a human being? Protests, petitions, resolutions, all sorts of political movements would, in the eyes of the IWW, never accomplish anything. They were a waste of time and money. The government is in the hands of the ruling class of white men and will do as they wish. No appeal to the political powers will ever secure justice to the black man. The black man had only one power to use, the power to fold his arms and refuse to work for the community until he is guaranteed fair treatment. The only power of the black man is his power as a worker. His one weapon is the strike. When they are in a position to say to any community, if you do not stop discrimination against the colored race, we will stop working for you, the hidden forces behind the government will see to it that lynchings cease and discrimination comes to an end. This sounded extremely militant, of course, and it was in keeping with the IWW belief in syndicalism and the general strike as the real answer to the basic problems of all workers. But what were black people to do to meet the day-to-day problems that faced them until they had achieved the power to force the master class to alter the pattern of discrimination and exploitation overnight? To this question, unfortunately, the IWW had no real answer. The failure of the IWW to recognize the black question as a special question and its lumping of the problems of black workers with those of all workers was quite in keeping with the trend in radical circles of this period. The American Socialist Party, like the entire Second International, also had a very simplistic view of the black question. The Socialist Party never really recognized the black question as a special question. To the Socialist Party, the class question was not only primary, but it was exclusive. There was no other social question. All questions, the Socialists thought, would be solved as a byproduct of the class question and the class revolution, just as the IWW thought that all questions would be solved through the general strike. The black question, as assumed loftily by the socialists, would be solved as a byproduct of the class struggle without any particular or specific attention to each question in its own terms and its own needs. That you might not be able to achieve a socialist revolution without proper and specific attention to something as vital, as central in our country as the black question was not perceived either by the Socialist Party or the Socialist Labor Party. That a simplistic class approach might even hinder the efforts to organize black workers was overlooked. However, there is a fundamental difference between the approach of the Socialist Party and the IWW on the black question, even though quite a few Wobblies were members of the Socialist Party. That is until 1912, when they were expelled presumably for advocating sabotage and opposing political action. The Socialist Party made no real effort to organize black people, and in the South even regarded black membership as a drawback inasmuch as it would alienate potential white members. Since black people in the South could not vote and the Socialist Party believed that socialism would come only through the ballot box, it was regarded as a waste of time to recruit black members into the party, thereby driving out white members who alone could vote for socialist candidates. To the limited degree that the Socialist Party recruited black members in the South, where the vast majority of blacks lived prior to World War I, it organized in segregated Jim Crow branches. To its credit, the IWW would have none of this. For one thing, as a syndicalist organization, it opposed political action at the ballot box as a waste of energy, and put its faith primarily in industrial organization and the general strike. Thus, the fact that black people were disenfranchised in the South was no problem for the IWW and its plans for building unity of black and white workers. Then again, at no time in history did the IWW, even in the deepest South, ever establish segregated locals for black workers. Wherever it organized, members were brought together in locals regardless of race or color. In fact, the Industrial Workers of the World is the only labor federation in the history of the American labor movement which never established a single segregated local. Even the Knights of Labor, which brought large numbers of skilled and unskilled black workers into the predominantly white labor movement of the 1880s, it's estimated that in 1886, when the membership of the Knights exceeded 700,000, there were no less than 60,000 black members, segregated its black membership. In 1887, there were 400 all-black locals in the Knights of Labor, the bulk of them in the South, where black workers were mainly concentrated. While the Knights did much in breaking down the walls of prejudice, the color line was never really breached, and the order never succeeded in eliminating the barriers between white and black. The IWW did achieve this goal within its ranks. No statistics are available which indicate black membership in the IWW. Sterling D. Sparrow and Abram L. Harris in The Black Worker estimate that of 1 million membership cards issued by the IWW during the active part of its life, that is between 1909 and 1924, 100,000 cards were issued to black workers. Actually, no IWW publication ever made such a claim, and it's likely that the Wobblies never succeeded in recruiting a very large black membership. Partly, this was due to the fact that many of the great organizing drives of the IWW were in the steel and textile industries of the North, in Pittsburgh, Lawrence, and Fall River, Massachusetts, and Paterson and Passaic, New Jersey, and in these industries prior to World War I, few black workers were employed. A common employer justification for not hiring black workers in the textile industry was that black workers could not work in a cotton mill because the hum of the looms put him to sleep.
Obviously, this particular comment didn't age too well.
Then again, not many black workers were employed by the lumber camps of the West or in western agricultural fields where the IWW also made significant headway. The black migratory workers in these industries found a haven in the IWW. In The Messenger of July 1923, George S. Schuler recalled the racial contacts among migratory workers who belonged to the IWW. There was no discrimination in the jungles of the IWW, he noted. The writer has seen a white hobo, despised by society, share his last loaf with a black fellow hobo. The two main areas where the IWW did recruit black membership were among the longshoremen and lumber workers in the South. The Philadelphia longshoremen, with Benjamin Harrison Fletcher as their leader, constituting one of the most effective IWW units when it was first organized in 1913, was made up primarily, but not entirely, of black people. For years prior to 1913, organization on the docks of Philadelphia had been frustrated by the employer's policies of pitting black and white workers against each other, threatening that if one group complained about conditions, their jobs would be given to the other. The IWW entered the picture with the appeal that whether white and black liked each other or not, their only hope was to organize into one union. Within a few months, the Marine Transport Workers Local 3 had been organized, the majority of its workers black, and struck for recognition on May 13, 1913. The strike was supported by ministers of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, who told the Public Ledger that the church liked the IWW because it believed in the colored man. After a strike of 2 weeks, the dock workers won recognition of their union and the right to bargain collectively. The union's membership by the end of 1913 was close to 3,000, and strikes in 1915 and 1960 completed its control of the docks. By 1916, the union had raised wages for black and white longshoremen from $1.25 to $4 a day, time and a half for the overtime and double time for Sundays. In keeping with its belief in equality of black and white, the local had a rotating system of chairmen. 1 month a black member was chairman, the next month a white member. Other locals of the Marine Transport Workers, composed largely of black longshoremen, were established in Baltimore, Galveston, and New Orleans, though none were as strongly organized as the Philadelphia local. But all maintained the principle of full equality of black and white members. In New Orleans, the American Federation of Labor's Central Labor Council was a lily-white organization refusing to admit delegates from the black unions of waterfront workers. In 1910, the IWW, under the leadership of Covington Hall and backed by the Dock and Cotton Council, established the United Labor Council. Into this council were admitted delegates from both white and black waterfront unions, and soon the council was an important force in the New Orleans labor scene. As in Philadelphia, the meetings of the council were chaired 1 week by a black and the next week by a white waterfront worker.
Hi, it's me again. I know you probably want to go click one of those other fancy-looking videos up in the feed, but wait a minute. That was part one. Part two will be out soon, or it might be out by the time you're watching this. I'll drop a link in the description once that's the case. And believe me, you'll want to see part two because it tells the story of one of the most incredible moments in working class history, the I.W.W. Lumber Strikes, which miraculously managed to unite black and white workers in the Deep South in solidarity and forced timber barons to take drastic action and ultimately forced the United States government to come down hard on Wobblies across the nation because they were just becoming too successful. So be sure to check that out, subscribe to this channel, and when part two comes out, don't miss it. You're gonna love it. Also, newsflash, there is an I.W.W. chapter up in upstate New York that's currently raising funds. They are having some trouble. I'll put a link to the fundraiser. They're also selling a pretty kickin' album with I.W.W. and other labor songs on it. So check that out and buy that if you want to support them. All that's in the description. I'll leave you now with a few borrowed words, which I came across in researching this video from the Wobbly newspaper Voice of the People. These words were written over a century ago, but I think that they make for a perfect ending to a YouTube video, though I may have changed a word here and there. Enjoy.
Here's your chance. You watched a video on NonCompete. You know it's worth a couple bucks a month. And then some. It gets better all the time. The old-timey vaudevillian voice characterizations alone are worth the price. If you haven't watched NonCompete Live, published on YouTube, then you've missed a lot. It gives the industrial news of the world. And you can support it on Patreon and Camaraderie for just a couple bucks a month. Then there's Breadville, a great comedy channel for communists and anarchists. It also can be supported for just a couple bucks a month. Here's our offer. NonCompete and Breadville, 1 month, $2. NonCompete Breadville and NonCompete Live, 1 year, $24. All three the same price because you can support them all on the NonCompete Cooperative Patreon. Better send that $2 right away to Patreon and camaraderie.com/noncompete. In renewing your sub, we don't need your address. that copy doesn't transfer well to what we're doing here. Thank you.